Uh, David, we're very happy to have you tonight, and you can probably tell us why we shouldn't have put our tomatoes in already and had that freeze that may have set us early birds back. But David's going to talk tonight about tomatoes. The topic is totally tomatoes, and he will cover information about the history of tomatoes, why tomatoes have different colors and taste different, diagnosing many of the disorders that occur, insects, other kinds of things that happen to our tomatoes. And David is well prepared for all this. He certainly comes from Davidson County, Tennessee Extension Agent, up around in the Nashville. Most of us know where Davidson County is by Nashville. David provides educational training on pesticide safety and training for pesticide applicators seeking commercial certification and licensing, and teaches training classes for master gardeners, programs in Davidson and surrounding counties. David conducts both commercial and consumer site visits throughout the county to diagnose and resolve issues with insects, plant diseases, and weeds. I was particularly interested in that. Do you weed for them too, or can I get you down to help out?
No, that's for master gardeners.
Okay. He is a frequent guest speaker for garden clubs, horticulture associations, and commercial pesticide workshops.
I'm going to add, David and I worked together at the diagnostic clinic for, I don't know, 5 to 7 years, 8 years maybe. And I found out that David, well, through those years, he's probably the most well-rounded naturalist I've ever been in touch with. David can talk about not just tomatoes, he can talk about insects, he can talk about native plants, he can talk about anything. And not only that, he can talk about horses, he can talk about anything in nature, wildlife. And so he's just been a really, really good friend over the years. We really want to appreciate what he's done for Extension, and I want to include this in the video too. So David, take it away. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Tom, and all the Chattanooga Master Gardens. Chattanooga is just a great city. If I could convince my wife to move there, I probably would. Yeah, Tom and I worked for many years in the diagnostic lab, and that's probably the best learning experience ever. You know, when you get out of college, you get a degree, you get a piece of paper that says you're smart. Well, you're really not until you go out and live life and accumulate experiences. That's where the real learning is. It's just living life. So being a county agent, it just opened up a lot of possibilities. If you're eager and passionate about learning, the opportunities are there. So I just took advantage of excellent mentors. And it's difficult keeping my mouth shut, my ears open when I listen to other people. But I think if I could speak like Dr. Alan Wyndham or listen to this person talk, I like what they did on their programs and all the do's and don'ts and the good things they did. And I said, I think I'll get to the point I'll have a career. Let's talk about tomatoes, and what an interesting topic. And yes, the stores in Donaldson are selling tomatoes. I went by the Ace Hardware store today on the way to work, and they're selling tomatoes and peppers and everything. And they predicted possibility of a freeze coming in. And so we're going to talk about what temperatures will do to tomatoes and the blooms and the disorders. So if you planted a tomato outside, you may want to bring it in for a few days as a house plant and then replant it again. And I have done that too. Everybody's so eager when we get to our really dead looking winters in Tennessee. And with this beautiful spring weather we've had, but it doesn't mean we will escape a freeze, a frost. You know, we'll talk about what that will do to a tomato plant too. So totally tomatoes, the most interesting fruit / vegetable, and I'll explain why I give it two different names and why that occurred. So let's get going here. Where are the tomatoes originally from? Not North America, not Central America, South America. So it is a tropical plant. It's very interesting. The tomato plant in these countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, this is where the tomato evolved, and it's at the base of the Andes Mountains, which is, I think, the longest chain of mountains in the world. And so it's a very temperate type climate these plants evolved in. And the tomato plant in this area is a perennial plant. It doesn't die back like it does because they don't have a harsh winter here. Now here, because we are in a temperate climate too, but in Tennessee we do have a very cold winter, which they don't experience in these countries. So the tomato is killed back by cold weather here. There wasn't a lot known for a long time about the tomato, and even it was safe to eat. Now, the original tomato, which I'm going to show you some pictures of, is not an edible plant. And scientists think that through various periods of mutation, it evolved. And then there's some native peoples in South America realized that they could farm this. And so there was a little bit of crossbreeding, pollination going on. So it took a long time for the tomato to look what it looks like today. So don't think, and most of our vegetables don't look anything like you see in the grocery stores today. They have evolved through a lot of hybridization and cross-pollination to develop large fruits that we can consume and have a lot of nutrition to them. So for more than about 200 years, and this after a specific date around 1554, and that's going back in time. When the first known record of tomato was written, it was gradually carried over the globe. And it was luck of the tomato and the people that lived in Europe that they kind of accepted, but it was the Italians that really took the tomato and developed it. And so we got to give credit to the Italians for using this fruit because of its red color and the plant family Solanaceae, which is nightshade plants, are deadly to eat. And a lot of people stayed away from the tomato because they thought it was poisonous. And a lot of people in the United States didn't really accept the tomato almost close to around early 1900s and a little bit later, because no one had ever eaten anything with an acidic flavor like that. We'd eaten vegetables. Vegetables are pretty mild tasting, so we have to add, sauces, salt and pepper, stuff like that onto them. Fruits have a naturally, generally sweet flavor, so people, you don't have to adjust to eating something sweet. People just eat something sweet and put a smile on their face. But a tomato was something acidic, and a lot of people just did not like. This is an acquired taste. Is what it is, the tomato. If you give a young child a tomato that's kind of acidic for the first time, you'll see them pucker and have a frown on their face. They got to get used to this unusual flavor. So the tomato had to grow on us is what it did. So here's some pictures, and this tomato plant still grows wild in these South American countries. It was mainly full of seed. And that was so the plant could prosper. It really wasn't for human consumption at that time. Even animals would not eat this. It was just chock full of seeds, didn't have much pulp to it. There was a lot of hairs on it. And scientists think the original tomato was, and it still is, found as mainly a small yellow fruit. It was thought that maybe a genetic mutation occurred and a red pigment developed. And so the tomato slowly, and through also crossbreeding, this red color developed. So you can still find this plant at the base of the Andes Mountains in South America. This is what the original tomato looked like. And again, it is a perennial plant. It was mainly a vine growing along the ground. And you can look at the leaves. The leaves don't really they don't look like a hybrid tomato leaf, and they don't really resemble that much of an heirloom tomato. So if you just saw the leaves of this plant alone, you'd probably have a hard time identifying it as a tomato plant. So since we didn't have cameras a long time ago, the earliest known records of what the tomato looked like was from still life paintings on, and it was very popular during certain periods of time where painters would paint vegetables, put them on a table, paint them. And so we see this rib tomato, and this is, look at the date of this picture, was 1826. So we have a good idea what original tomatoes started to look like when people started to accept them and grow them as a vegetable. So now here's an interesting fact. Think about how many plants or vegetables have had to go to like a Supreme Court or something. And then Congress had to pass laws on this. Well, it was this tax act, Tariff Act of 1883. It was going to impose 10% tax on imported vegetables. And the tomato started gaining a little bit of popularity. And then a few years after that, an importer wanted to exempt the tomato from this tax because he said the tomato is technically and scientifically it's not a vegetable, it is a fruit. And so when you take the Master Garden Botany class, you learn what a fruit is. So this case went to the Supreme Court. Now I'll have to look up to see how many vegetables have been discussed with the Supreme Court, and maybe those people on the Supreme Court, I don't know if they're good gardeners or not. So this Justice Gray wrote, he said, botanically speaking, tomatoes are fruits of a vine, just as are cucumbers, squash, beans, and peas. But you notice he said, are the fruits of a vine. Now that was just a general term used back then. They weren't using it as a scientific term. So he said that in common language, it is used in a main course with other vegetables, and he'll list them like potatoes, carrots, parsnips, turnips, on and on. And also with soup and fish and meats. So it should be considered a vegetable because a fruit is served after the main course. So the tomato was served as a main course type food. And so the court decision was they rejected the botanical truth, and that the tomato is in fact a large sized berry, and deferred it to the culinary vernacular of vegetable to describe it. So isn't that interesting? Here's the tomato plant that had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, I don't think anybody told the plant that is a vegetable or a fruit. Either way, plant could care less. And it doesn't matter because it's not going to change the flavor if you like tomatoes or not. But look at the variety you could find on heirloom tomatoes. Now, in heirloom, any type plant, whether it's something for food or just for landscape, it's generally is a plant that's been passed down through several generations of family because it has some valued characteristics to it. And an heirloom plant has to be an open pollinated, and that's what the early tomatoes are. And because of open pollination, you could get a lot of crossbreeding, and some of them have very unusual colors, all the way from green, yellow, orange. It's almost a rainbow of colors until they get very dark. Now, on the right side, the really dark ones, these flavors are really intense, and they have been described sometimes as real intricate tasting wines. They have a lot of flavonoids, unusual volatile chemicals in them that a lot of people don't like to eat the really dark red, almost black tomatoes because they have an intense flavor. If you start going to the left, with the color fades to orange, yellow, and green, the flavor is very mild tasting. So, and less acidity in there. We'll talk about that later. So if you have an issue with acidic foods, you're going to choose an orange, yellow, get down to the green tomatoes. Now, you're going to see that the flavor is a little bit diminished in these two. And we'll examine why the flavor and the look, where does that color come from? Now, I think you'll be surprised is why a tomato has a particular color. So the tomato is really probably the most domesticated type of vegetable / fruit we grow. And again, the original plant was to to propagate the species because all the massive amount of seeds that filled up the inside of the plant. And it wasn't really around the 1920s where a lot of genetic improvement. And these improvements mainly were to increase the size of the tomato. They wanted it large and they wanted it really red. So an interesting fact about, and Tom will back me up on this too. We try to manage disease issues. I don't say control. We try to manage a lot of disease issues on whether it's an ag crop or a horticultural plant by breeding in a resistance. So then we don't have to treat with a lot of chemicals, but the resistance to at least 44 major diseases in tomatoes and in the wild tomato plant, at least 20 of these resistant characteristics have been bred into the varieties that we eat now. So how did that, the resistance was there already. And through genetic manipulation, you may get lucky enough that this resistant crosses over into the variety that you have. And it could be through a natural mutation that the resistance carried over to. So we don't have resistance to all diseases, but it's almost about half the diseases of tomatoes you can manage through selecting a resistant variety. And most of these are going to be a hybrid type tomato. But the most obvious feature of domestication was the massive increase in fruit size. And if you look at any gardening catalog, you see tomatoes that they're getting the version, they're like grapefruits now. I mean, they would cover an entire slice of bread. If you ate one that big, you'd be filled up. So I go for a smaller size. I like kind of more like tennis ball size tomatoes. So what about tomato culture? People always call Extension and probably Master Gardens and ask about, my tomato is not setting fruit. Well, it's a picky little plant because it grew in a natural habitat with a particular temperature range. So we take these plants and we move them all over the world and we plant them into a zone where the temperature range is a little bit more extreme, or we rush to put them out too early in the soil. A lot of people don't get bloom set, don't get fruit set on them to get kind of fed up with it, and they pull their plants out way too soon. You could have a late crop. And this is a very temperature dependent plant. And this is because of pollination and bloom set. So most varieties will not set fruit with temperatures below 50 degrees. Now 50 degrees is just cool. That's not even, we're not even near freezing or frost. But if the temperature gets above 90 degrees, you're not going to get a lot of fruit set either. And you won't, and the tomato plant will abort a lot of their flowers. So you're talking about a 40 temperature degree range, which is really picky for a particular plant where a lot of crops will continue to produce in flower and set fruit, but not the tomato. It's a very finicky little plant. So another important thing is anyone that smokes or uses any type of tobacco product, you should always wash your hands really thoroughly before handling tomatoes, because you may be the vector to spread a viral infection to a tomato plant. Even when tobacco is cured, harvested, cured, and put into some type of product to chew or smoke, whatever you want to do with it, pipe, the viral pathogen is not destroyed. And touching a tobacco product, touch a tomato plant, you have spread a disease that can destroy your tomato plant. So be picky about that. Anybody that smokes. About tomato culture, you got to have at least 8 hours of direct sunlight. If you don't, you're going to have a tall, spindly little plant. It will stretch out to find sunlight. 6 hours is still basically not enough. 8 hours, as much sun as you can get, but a minimum is probably going to be 8 hours. And if I was so stubborn, I said, I'm going to have a tomato plant and I don't have enough daylight, I would suggest someone go with a determinate, which set fruit early in the season. And then you probably have more success than using an indeterminate. So what about the pH? Ideally 6.5 to 7. If you're a little bit above or below that, that is still fine. But if you can, now most of your vegetables you're going to see will grow ideally. Most plants grow best in a pH like that. You should not set your tomatoes in the garden until the weather and the soil temperature is actually above 60 degrees. What that can do, temperatures below that can injure the root system and stunt the plant for the entire growing season. So again, temperatures are very critical. A week of cool daytime temperatures below 55 degrees will stunt plants for the entire growing season and reduce yield. So right now, our weather is a roller coaster in Tennessee. A couple of days ago, it was warm. A few days before that, we get it to 80 degrees, get to 70 degrees. But we're going to stick around the 60s now, but that's not going to let tomato plants grow real well. But when the temperatures improve, the plants will improve too. So what will cold weather injury look like? Well, every year when I go to various garden centers and they get in a big shipment of tomato plants to sell the big box stores, private garden centers, and they never take them inside where there's heat. So the tomatoes are kind of acclimating to certain temperatures and certain amount of sunlight and wind, which are considered stresses, plant stresses. So on the picture on the left, you can see a light frost just does a lot of cosmetic damage to a plant. Frost is where the water will form ice crystals on the surface of the leaf. The inside of the leaf actually doesn't freeze. Now, when you get down to below 32 degrees, the water inside the plant cells will actually freeze and destroy the contents of that cell. Now, the difference is a frost will cause little white spotty areas on the tomato leaf, but a freeze, the leaves will get very dark, and then they will die. So there's a difference in there. And it's best to wait till at least the first or second week of May before you can put a tomato plant inside, because the soil has not reached a critical temperature for ideal root growth. So what about pollination? I'm going to tell you, it's all about temperature here. If nighttime temperatures drop below 55 degrees, pollen fails to develop, and the flowers that open the following morning will not set fruit. So you will get maybe a lot of flowers, and all of a sudden next day it might just drop off. So a plant's mission in life is to, particularly if you're an annual plant, and here, remember, tomato plant is an annual, is to continue the species. Now, the plant doesn't have a nervous system or a brain, is not thinking, well, how do we do this? Well, you need to develop flowers, which are reproductive parts of a plant, and develop seed. And then the seed will continue the species. But this will not happen with temperatures below 55 degrees. Now, you can get chemical sprays called blossom set sprays, and they can help set fruit even in cool nights. So a little bit more about temperature. Now let's go to the extreme on temperature. If the daytime temperature reaches 90 degrees, and this happens every year in Tennessee during our summertime, I look at the time in the morning, about 10 a.m. in the morning, and those are the mornings I never want to go outside. Blossoms that open that morning, they will be aborted. So you've got that ideal 40-degree temperature range that tomatoes really like. The blossom set sprays are not effective under high temperatures, only cooler temperatures. Now, the male part of the flower called the anther, where the pollen is produced, it's a very tiny slit, and the pollen has a very difficult time falling out of the slits in the anthers. So it accumulates a lot of pollen in the anther, but it cannot dislodge that. So what we call buzz pollination, it's called sonication. Bumblebees, we need a big bee that has large wing muscles and large wings. And without this, if we didn't have these big bumblebees doing this, you would have to go by, and this is still a good method. If you have a small garden with stake tomato plants, when you walk by and check your tomato plants, grab that stake and shake it real hard. And walk by each one and shake it. That will actually help with releasing the pollen from the male part called the anther. So here's a picture of a bumblebee. Now what this bumblebee is doing, it could care less about the pollen. It is not there for the pollen. It's there for the nectar, the plant sap. And so it's a good energy food. So what that bee is doing, they have a tongue, it's like a dagger, and they will pierce the base of the flower, and that's where the nectar glands are. So accidentally, they are causing, by shaking this plant and grabbing hold of this flower, and notice on a tomato plant what direction the flower points. It will always point downward. So if you didn't have bumblebees coming by, the female part, the stigma, which is very sticky, and that allows a single pollen grain to stick to it. If you shake that tomato stake, you'll help drop pollen down into the female part called the stigma, and you'll be the bee, the bumblebee doing that. So this is a bit close up. The bee again is not going after the pollen. Pollen will fall off, but it's almost like being a nectar robber, we call it. Carpenter bees are notorious nectar robber bees. Okay, so we know about when to plant tomato plants and what temperature does. Temperature plays a big role in pollination and fruit set. Well, where does all this color come from? I can't think of, now there are many plants that we grow in our vegetable gardens now, like even carrots, radishes, and they can have a variety of colors too. Peppers can, but tomatoes run the rainbow of colors. I think if you just could find a tomato of every color and cut it all up, that could be the best looking salad without anything other ingredient in it. So let's look at why tomatoes have a color to us, why they appear that way. Well, if you have a red tomato, you actually they have kind of a pink or red interior, what we call the flesh, but the skin is actually yellow. So the combination of a yellow skin and a pink or red interior gives the tomato fruit a red color. But a pink tomato actually has the same interior, similar to a red, but the skin is clear. So what about a green tomato? Well, there's at least two what we call variants. A yellow-green colored is created from yellow skin, but over a green interior. Then if you have a really bright green tomato, which does not have yellow in it, it comes from a green interior, but with a clear skin. So the color of the skin has a great impact on whether the fruit looks to us. Black, brown, purple tomatoes, they actually retain some chlorophyll or green pigment during ripening. And the green color combined with kind of a crimson red, really pretty red interior, produces a dark red coloration. So a good example would be Cherokee purple, has that dark chlorophyll with red coloration flesh, but it has a clear skin. So I think one of these days I'm going to try to peel some tomatoes and check this color out and see if I probably wouldn't be able to tell the color if you peeled one. Where does the flavor come from on a tomato? Well, it's a good balance between acidity and sugar. Plus, tomatoes are very complicated fruits. They have a lot of chemical compounds that affect the flavor, aroma, the way they smell to us. Tomatoes that taste very acidic, and these are the ones that people had to, it's an acquired taste. People say that's kind of a sour taste. They have really high levels of acids, but they have very low levels of sugars in them. But a tomato that has a sweet taste is just the opposite. They're low in acids, and the sugar content is much higher. Now, if a tomato is a little on the bland side, but you're going to find some of the orange and yellow, but I think they still have really good flavors, but they're not as intense as a red tomato or the dark red black tomatoes. You get a very good balance between the acids and the sugars. And so they kind of balance each other out. So here's a pretty neat chart. And we call it tomato flavor guide. So this would be something good to maybe just print off this one single page if you go to a farmer's market somewhere, and you can go, well, what do I want? If I want a yellow or a whitish colored tomato in the center, I would go, okay, they're mild, and they have, it's one with a high sugar, low acidity. If you have a red or pink, these are called these classic colors of tomato. What we think a tomato should look like. You can get a balanced sugar, balanced acidity. Ones for burgers and salads. A lot of them may have now also you got to decide if you want something that has a real high water content. All tomatoes don't have a high water content to them. Some have a very meaty texture. So the flesh can vary a lot inside a tomato. Some are so watery they would not be good. They may be better in a salad or as a juice tomato, but not on a slice of bread. Then again, we have a lot of the small varieties. So here, if we go to the far right, we look at the colors that are very black. These are the ones that have generally high sweetness, but high acidity too. And if they're not balanced just right, you're going to pick up a lot of more complicated flavors. So I have some friends that just don't like the Cherokee purple. They said that flavor is too intense for me. I can't do that. So it's the flavor is if you get, what I suggest people do, get a tomato of every one of these colors and try one, and then maybe eat a cracker in between, drink a little water, then try another one too. But I would tell people this would be a great blindfold test. Have someone do this, have master gardeners do this, and try to guess what color the tomato was that you ate. And tell somebody, put it on a chart. Do you think this was acidic, or was it more mild flavor, or sweet, or was it bland? This would be an interesting program, because a lot of times we taste with our eyes. We see food, and right away we know what we expect it to taste like. But if you're blindfolded and you put something in front of you, sometimes people couldn't say, I don't know what I just ate. But tomatoes it'd be a fun kind of activity, I think. So tomato flavor, size of fruit, cherry and grape tomatoes generally are more concentrated and they have a high sugar content than the full size tomatoes. So they get a more natural sweet flavor. It's just packaged in a small content is what it is. So it's more concentrated. The color of fruit, again, the different pigments and tomatoes tend to produce different balances of sugars and acids. Yeah, some of the black tomatoes created from a mixture of green and red pigments have a reputation, and I've said this earlier, having a very complex flavor, almost hard to describe. Now, foliage plays a big key issue here too. So a lot of leaves can capture, obviously, a lot of sunlight. So a plant with dense, healthy foliage can convert more sunlight into sugars, and you're going to get a better tasting tomato. So we're going to talk about what happens if you sucker a plant too much. You may affect the flavor of the fruit itself. So what is the difference between indeterminate and determinate? And this is important. You're going to see in the next few slides. If you over sucker a determinate plant, you're really going to change its growth habit. So an indeterminate will produce flowers and blooms through the entire growing season. It will have fruit that is ripened, fruit that is not in the right stage yet. It will put out more flowers. It will continue nonstop this cycle until cold weather comes in and stops everything. So you're going to get tomatoes and different stages of ripening. But a determinant is the height is set. So the terminal buds at the top set fruit and stop stem growth. That's what they do. So it's a hormone activity that goes on. Hormones actually are produced in the stems of plants and then also in the tips of roots. So all the blossoms and fruits generally develop around the same time. And so your harvest window is very short. But these type of tomatoes, determinate, don't require extensive staking. Some of them don't even, some might just need a cage without a stake. But you got to be careful about suckering. Now they will sucker too. So this is a slide I call a sucker born every day. So tomatoes develop these little side shoots we call a sucker. Now, if you leave those on, you're obviously going to get a lot more foliage, but also you're going to get more blooms. But as with fruit trees, if all the blooms set fruit, the fruit probably is going to be smaller. And this would be a good example with the tomato plant. So if I decide to cut that off, snap it off, break it off, more energy grows in producing larger fruit, but fewer fruit. And so generally a lot of people in greenhouses is very common to if you're familiar with a holly called a sky pencil holly, it's a very thin, narrow landscape shrub. This is what tomatoes can look like. But in a greenhouse, they will pack as many tomatoes in as close as they can and do some heavy pruning and suckering. Then they get really large tomato plants, and they can get 4 times the amount in a high tunnel or greenhouse than they could ever plant it outside. But you've got to really watch them. So a determinate tomato, this is important here if you're going to remove some of these suckers. Now, removing all the suckers up to the one immediately below the first flower. So and I'll show you a picture of this. If you remove that, removing the sucker immediately below the first flower, this can result in the stunting of that tomato plant. And to determine it is already a small tomato plant. So you don't want to stunt it. You want to make it a dwarf, you know. So prune when the suckers are generally about 2 to 4 inches long. So if you look at a determinate tomato plant and you see the blooms at the top, very top, and the suckers, you want to sucker below that. If you, and most times, I don't think you probably need to sucker out a determinate. Now, if you are overzealous in this act of removing all these suckers, what's going to happen? You're going to expose the fruit for potential sun scald, because then the less foliage, when the fruit is being produced and you get a lot of hot western sun, you expose that fruit to a lot of hot sun and you can get what we call sun scald. So let's look at a few what we call disorders of fruits, and these are very common. These are not diseases, though. They are not contagious. A disease is contagious, but a disorder can happen on many different varieties at the same time because of environmental conditions. And the main environmental condition, again, temperature. It's all about temperature. And I always say that tomatoes are temperature dependent. So what causes the flowers to drop off? And again, it's these unusual temperatures. And so nighttime temperatures lower than 55. Now, and if you get above 95, these are very specific temperatures. And generally when we get temperatures like that, the air is pretty dry. And sometimes we get some winds. Tomato plants do not set flowers. Any flowers on the plants will be aborted. So a lot of people just finally give up. But when the weather cools down, late summer going into the fall, you can still have a great fall harvest, late summer fall harvest of the fruit, the tomatoes. So I've talked to a lot of people. I said, well, how are your plants doing? Well, I don't know. I just pulled them all out of the ground. I'm going to the grocery store to buy them now. You're going to buy those tasteless things out of the grocery store you could play tennis with? No, you don't want to. You should have kept your plants. the flower drop usually disappears as the weather improves. Now, blossom drop in high temperature. This can occur on many varieties. Most of these disorders occur on heirlooms. There are a lot of hybrids that have been bred, so a lot of these disorders are not as predominant as they used to be. But when a temperature exceeds 92 on some varieties, and the nighttime temperatures stay 68, you'll also get blossom drop. It depends on the specific type heirloom or hybrid you have, but bottom line is don't give up on the tomato. So what causes this deterioration of the opposite of the stem end, we call the blossom end, because that's where the original flower was being produced. So again, it's not a disease, it's a calcium deficiency. And this can be quite common with your early tomatoes. If you don't water on a regular basis on a tomato, don't overwater, because you may cause a condition called growth cracking. We'll show that later. Calcium is hard for a tomato plant to translocate calcium all through it. And calcium is responsible for good cell wall construction. And what happens, the cell wall of tomato collapses, and it doesn't cause this kind of decay all through the plant. It can occur on a green, unripe tomato. You can just cut that out. It's not uncommon if you go to a farmer's co-op or at a school, at a church, a community has one, and a little farmer's market, and you see a few tomatoes with a little bit blemished in like this. And a lot of these may be heirlooms. They're still good. You just cut it out a little, and you can then consume the tomato. But again, it's not a disease. But this generally with regular, consistent watering, this helps move calcium through the plant eventually, and this disorder goes away by itself. So if you can maintain that soil pH from about 6.5 up to 7, but 6.5 is an ideal pH range for calcium uptake in tomato plants. Use nitrate, nitrogen as fertilizer. Again, avoid water stress and wide fluctuations in watering, because this changes the uptake of calcium. The foliar application of calcium really kind of a little value because of the poor absorption and movement to the fruit where it's needed. So calcium doesn't like to move. It's not really mobile in a plant very well. But if you feel better, you said, I've got to do something, I'm going to spray blossom end rot spray. Do it. You may not see a lot of good results. Maybe makes you sleep better at night. So what about this sun scald? It could be because you were a little overzealous in suckering the tomato plant, because you were maybe going for bigger tomatoes. So when we have some really hot summer days, in 2019, when we went to a droughty, hot days with the temperatures were above, I think we set a number of record consistent 90-degree days in Tennessee. I remember that year people were just about giving up on tomato plants. I said, don't give up on them. And some people didn't. They called me back and said, wow, my tomatoes are finally producing. But some, they said, look like they've got a tan colored skin on one side. And they said, is that facing the western sun? I said, well, I never thought about it. I said, well, check it out, and you'll see that generally that part of the fruit is facing the western sun, and it gets a sunburn, a scald we call it. So you might want to limit the kind of pruning, suckering of the foliage. And remember that good amount of foliage, you're getting more photosynthesis producing carbohydrates, which convert into sugars in your tomato fruit. And this can occur on a green tomato too. And this also can occur on your pepper plants. So look for a sun scald. I've even seen eggplant scald sometimes. Growth cracks, not a lot you can do with this. This generally occurs not because people water too much, because Mother Nature didn't stop these spring rains we have, or summer rains when we get them. So they occur at the stem end, because this is the area where the influx of water is coming into the fruit. And the inside of the fruit grows much quicker than the skin. The skin cannot expand quick enough, and slight little cracks appear. Sometimes it's almost like a crevasse. They're deep cracks, and they don't really expose the interior of the fruit to, you would think a disease pathogen would get in there and cause a lot of rot and decay, but it really doesn't. So you can just cut out the stem end. Now, the blossom end is where you're going to see what we call the opposite end, where blossom end rot occurs. Now, this generally occurs from just many heavy days of heavy rainfall. So if we get a lot of rainfall in your area, don't water. A few years back, I went to a lady's house, and she was known for growing great tomatoes, giving to her neighbors. They loved her. Then one year, it rained a lot, and she continued to water, and her neighbors were really disappointed in the appearance of her tomatoes, because they had growth cracks, all of them, radial growth cracks and concentric ring growth cracks. And it wasn't, well, it was kind of her fault. She just kept watering. I said, why are you watering? We just had last week 2 inches of heavy rainfall. She said, my friends don't like my tomatoes anymore. Well, the important thing is that they like you. And I said, you can tell them this is just a disorder. So she stopped doing this, and finally the tomato plants got better. And I think her friends, they came around too. So growth cracks originate from the stem end and work their way down to the blossom end. They're always going to be at the stem end of the plant. Of course, you can get what we call a radial or concentric ring. And it depends on the varieties. If you buy a tomato plant, maybe it's going to be an heirloom, you can probably expect this. If you buy a hybrid, look for something on the label if it says resistant to sun scald, maybe resistant to, a little more resistant to growth cracking. So you can maybe avoid these disorders, not diseases. So about cracking, it depends on, again, the variety. Some of the newer varieties are resistant to cracking. Keep a consistent soil moisture, keep it very uniform. So what about this cat facing? This would be the ugly tomato contest. Now, the ones in the center, if they have just a little bit of this and you don't see a lot of indentation, this is sometimes referred to as zippering, because it looks like a closed zipper on a piece of clothing. These tomatoes still have the great flavor. They're actually nightmare to peel, so you want to use these as juicers to make them sauce out of. And this is a result of cold temperature, and not when the fruit was already on the plant. It's when the blossom was on the plant. And see the very bottom sentence, temperatures below 50 degrees that occur at flowering and fruit set. That's when you don't even see the fruit. The plant is starting to go into a fruit set, which can result in poor pollination. This increases it's a disorder, cat facing. So we want to make sure the soil temperature is about 60 degrees, and it's best to wait till about second week of May, when we know we're going to be out, hopefully out of any kind of cold weather injury to tomato plants. They are, again, temperature dependent. They're very finicky about temperature. I don't know if Tom has seen this much. Every year I've just had about 2 calls a year on this, and called green shoulders. So if a tomato plant had a shoulder, it'd be at the stem end. And this is due to chlorophyll, and it's not breaking down because the tomato plant is exposed to too much sunlight, which could be the result of too much suckering those new little stems that are coming out of tomato plants. So you're exposing the fruit to more sunlight. So the chlorophyll on the tomato at the top, the stem end, that's where it's more concentrated, breaks down slowly or doesn't break down, and you don't get any ripening at the top. So that would actually have to be cut out. So if you see this is what we call green shoulders. So how to prevent this is to provide some shade to the fruit during extreme heat. But if you're a little bit eager to sucker a lot of those new stems out, you may cause this problem called green shoulders. So here we go. We got to talk about insects sometimes. So these are stink bugs, and now we have this brown marmorated stink bug, and I think I've found about 15 or 20 in my house this year. Stink bugs overwinter as adults, so they get a head start, and by the time you got tomato plants out and peppers and eggplant, green, doesn't matter, they'll feed on just about any time. They're already in an adult stage and they're hungry. So what they do, a true bug has a beak type mouth part, and they will pierce through the skin of a tomato, and a true bug cannot digest food inside its body. So they pierce the skin. It's like getting a shot, and they inject digestive enzymes into the flesh of the fruit itself. And they wait around with that mouth part inside the tomato fruit, or it could be in a bean pod, an eggplant, a pepper plant, okra. And the digestion occurs inside the fruit itself. And so when a lot of these solid components are break down into a more liquid form, they suck up all the liquid content. Now, remember, these plants have a cell membrane, which is destroyed, but the cell wall remains intact and it is rigid. And so when the contents are sucked out, air rushes in to fill up that void. And that's why you get this a white, little off color look to it. Now, sometimes all tomato plants will have some type of tiny little pricks on them like this. And if you always wonder if that was, some of it is not this is pretty severe. Again, it's just below the skin of the fruit. So you want to cut that out. Most people would probably not want to pick that one out as the one they want to buy at a farmer's market, but it's still a good tomato. So we call this cloudy spot. And there is a really big insect, a true bug, called a leaf-footed bug, and they're enormous. They're harmless to humans. They don't bite or sting or do anything to us, but they may accumulate. They kind of wait around until the tomato fruit is getting ripe. And the stink bugs really like ripe tomatoes. They can tell a tomato is ripe by the volatile chemicals that are released as their fruit is ripening. So that's what happens when you cut it open. You may see the inside that's a little bit white looking. The contents of the cell wall, cells are missing. Cell wall is still intact. Still a good fruit to eat though. So I've only seen this a couple times in my career. A lot of it was when we have periods of cool, rainy weather, which is kind of unusual during the growing season in Tennessee. But it can happen. And when it does, it may cause a disorder called tomato leaf roll. Now, there is a disease that can look like this. But if you look at these tomato plants, they're not diseased. Now, when the conditions change, this is very interesting, you get normal growth. And this is an heirloom tomato too. You can see by the shape of the leaf. The leaves that grew during the cooler, rainy environment curled up and became thick, a lot thick and more leathery. So are they going to unopen? No, they won't. Does it impact the plant in any way? Not really. It looks kind of weird. I guarantee you, if you had a pick your own tomato patch and you invited people over and you had tomato plants that did not have this disorder, no one's going to walk over to these tomato plants going, something is really wrong with these tomato plants. And probably something's wrong with the fruit. I'm not going to pick that fruit. There's nothing wrong with this fruit. This is called tomato leaf roll. It's a physiological disorder that's related to, again, temperature and excessive moisture in the soil. Now, when conditions favor the growth of the tomato plant, look at the top of this plant. It's normal again. So it looks like two different plants, but the lower leaves are not going to unroll, but they will still produce a lot of good carbohydrates through photosynthesis because that's not really impacted. And you're going to get tomatoes throughout this plant. This is common on some, not the indeterminate, but on the indeterminate, but the determinate grow too soon. and produce fruit early on. So they generally escape this type of disorder. Very interesting, I think. But the last one is the most interesting I've ever seen. Now, I have never seen a tomato that grew tomato sprouts out through the fruit itself. But the picture on the left is a tomato I had. And the first time I saw this, I was in the diagnostic lab. I believe Tom was working that year too. And two ladies brought this in, a tomato, to me. And they said, we want you to tell us what kind of worms are in our tomato. I said, okay, do you have the fruit? They said, yes, we do. So they had already cut them open. And they showed them to me. And I said, well, I've never seen this. But I said, these are not any type of an insect larvae or worm. I said, these seeds have sprouted inside your tomato plant. And at the time, I didn't know what caused this. And I didn't even know the term for it. The term is vivipary. I'll show you that next slide. And I said to the lady, I said, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with this tomato plant. I said, you can eat it. And you know what they said? You eat it. I said, well, oh, you're going to give this? They look like worms to us. And I said, well, you don't see them moving, do you? They were eating with their eyes. They said, no. They said, I'm sorry, we can't do this. I said, if I could somehow breed a tomato all the tomatoes could do this, I would capitalize on this. I'd say, I would market these as your tomato with tomato sprouts, the healthiest tomato you've ever eaten. But it's due to a breakdown of a hormone in an overripening tomato. So if you keep a tomato too long, this is what can happen. So if you look up very close shot here, these seeds are actually sprouting. Now, when you cut open a tomato, everybody has seen this little white gelatinous type material surrounding the seeds. There's hormones in there, and they prevent seed germination. So they keep the seeds in a dormant state. So the seeds actually would like to germinate, because where do seeds germinate best? Generally in a dark area away from sunlight with moisture. That is the perfect environment inside a tomato fruit. So tomatoes develop this gelatinous material where the hormone stays that keeps the seed asleep and dormant. But when that hormone starts to break down due to overripening, and again, plants, their mission is to produce seed that will turn ripe, and hormones do break down naturally in nature. Otherwise, seeds will never germinate. But this can happen inside tomatoes. So last year, or the year before that, I actually had a fruit. I got so excited, and I showed it to my wife. She said, now that's weird. I said, well, we're going to have a tomato bacon, baconless tomato sandwich. She says, well, I don't know. Maybe I'll have another. I said, look, I tell you, I said, I'm an extension agent. I know about this stuff. I really didn't. I said, it's not going to hurt you. She said, well, you eat it. And I said, I've heard that before, So seed sprouting, when the natural hormone abscisic acid is produced in an overripe tomato, the mature seeds break dormancy and sprout. So it's very interesting. So that's this moist environment allows the seedlings to grow without drying out. And the term is called vivipary. So it's very interesting. Tomatoes have a lot of challenges, particularly with weather, which can cause a lot of disorders, which are not diseases. But this is the main one we're still working on. I don't know what to do. We're going to do about this little thing right here. So you got to admit, they're too cute. So thank you all for allowing me to present a program. I thought it was interesting, but there's a lot more to tomatoes than you can ever imagine when it comes to color, flavor. When you eat other vegetables like squash, they have a certain flavor. You're going to have this consistent flavor. Now, peppers have a little more complicated flavors to them, but all these hot peppers, they mask the really good flavors that peppers can have. Let me mention something about a pepper. I heard on NPR the other day that some plant scientist working at a university, he's just appalled now with all the extremely hot peppers that are That's all you could buy now, it seems like. But and he's studied peppers. I can't remember who it was, but he studied peppers for years. He said a lot of these hot peppers have great, beautiful flavors, but they're masked by the extreme chemical heat produced. So he said he has developed habanero, and that's generally where I stop with habaneros that set me on fire. I have what I call gringo lips. A friend of mine said, she invited me over. We had some good Mexican food, and I said, "Holy, this is hot." She said, "This is not hot." They said, "This is mild." I said, "What do you consider mild?" She said, "You have gringo lips." I said, "I know I do." I said, "I can go with a jalapeno." But this scientist said, habaneros have beautiful flavor, but you don't get that flavor because the overbalance of heat in there covers it all up. So they developed a habanero that is not hot at all, and said the flavor is so intense. So I'm going to have to find out what that pepper is. So, but tomatoes, the flavors, the different balances between acidity and sugars, the color, it runs an endless gauntlet. And I think that's why people like tomatoes. They're good to grow. They're easy to grow, but temperature will play havoc sometimes. So don't give up on your tomatoes, and grow a variety and thoroughly enjoy them, because it's a wonder of nature, I think, that they have developed in another country to a plant that was not even edible to what we have today, which is probably the most popular vegetable ever grown. Thank y'all.
Thank you, David.
Do have a question about tomatillos, and I assume the question was they use it for their salsa, and they had a lot of flowers but no fruit. And I guess that what you talked about, temperature, may be the same for tomatillos as tomatoes. But
I believe it is. I'm not that familiar with them. I just remember when I grew some one year, there was the stickiest things. I mean, I don't know what that stickiness is from. Tomatoes aren't that sticky, but generally any plants that are even in the same plant family, they'll have same issues and can have similar disorders. Temperature, and even with changing temperatures in Tennessee, I'll probably make a prediction that one of these years our summers are going to be very long, our fall and winter are going to be pretty short, and then we're just going to jump into hot weather again. So tomato plants people are going to have to breed some new characteristics in tomato plants and related plants, so they can tolerate some extreme temperatures. We can't wait years and years for a natural mutation to occur. Well, a tomato plant will just produce set fruit when it's 95 degrees.
Yeah.
Because that's not uncommon in our summers anymore.
Exactly.
So,
and probably get more common, huh?
Yeah, there are people working on cold weather tolerant tomatoes now. So to introduce a gene from a plant that is cold tolerant, and if you could do that, we could then set our tomatoes out really early, and then not have to worry about bringing them inside as a house plant. Hopefully, everybody generally has a favorite tomato, but try some other ones too. Try something you've never tried before. Now, if you do like the really complicated aromas and flavors in the dark, there are several varieties, heirlooms of really dark tomatoes, which I do like those. But if you like a lot of the yellow, the milder, the orange, try different ones, and you might have come up with a new favorite again. So there's just an endless variety of tomatoes out there, and life is too short not to try as many as you can.
And I guess, like you mentioned, the box stores and hardware stores and actually garden centers are selling tomatoes now. Would the best thing just wait, or if you see something you like, get it and maybe keep it in a place that before planting it in a few weeks?
Well, if see, there's a farmer I work with in Jolton, Tennessee, and the grower is a young guy family, And he decided that he would grow a lot of starter plants for other producers too and farmers. And that's what he grows a lot to sell as his CSA. People can come buy tomatoes, but he grows such a variety of tomatoes and heirlooms. And he keeps adding greenhouses every year. And May 1st, he's having his first plant sale. I'm going to go up there and buy me some plants, but I'll probably keep them for a week in my house. But I want to find some varieties I've never heard of. He has become an expert tomato grower, and he is growing just thousands of plants he has, and he grows starter plants. So yeah, if you and at the Ace Hardware store when the other day in Dawson, I couldn't believe how many heirlooms they were selling. A lot. The heirlooms are taking over the market, it seems like. You can always go to the grocery store and buy what I call a tennis ball, because they'll bounce and they don't bruise very easy. But the heirlooms are flooding the market again. But if you could, even if you got any kind of a soil thermometer, you can buy them real cheap, stick it in the ground, and make sure that I'd like to see that soil temperature get about 70 for good root growth.
Good.
It won't take much longer for that soil to warm up.
Had a question, I think for Tammy. Said since water rain or whatever you're doing fluctuates so much, is there a good way to check the soil moisture, seeing if the soil moisture is short or seeing if the plant will wilt?
What you want to do is you want to make sure where tomatoes are grown, soil drains very well, really well. The amount of rainfall we get, I think in the Nashville area, we are 6 inches over already for the year, but we're running a little behind for this month, but the soil is not absent of moisture by any means. And if you have a raised bed, most of the different type raised bed soil mixtures they put in there drain very well, but tomatoes need an area that drains very well. Before I would have plants in the ground, I would make sure you can do a quick soil drainage test by actually digging a hole about 1 foot deep and maybe a foot square all the way around, fill it full of water, and wait to see how long it takes to drain. Now, fill it full of water. When it drains, fill it full of water again till it's what we call saturated. And then generally after wash it, after so many hours, after 24 hours when gravity pulls that water down, then the soil is at what we call a field capacity, is holding all the water it can. But if it stands there for over a day and it's not draining, that would not be you need to improve the soil to drainage. And it could be by just creating a little berm. And it could be that some people might need a raised bed or a big container to grow tomato in. That's a great way to grow tomato. Big pot.
Good. Just have a comment. How do you avoid those tomato caterpillars?
Well, you can't. They are generally, the caterpillar is called a hornworm. The main species we have here is the tobacco hornworm, believe it or not, because tobacco is in the tomato family too. The tomato hornworm is more of a northern species. So it doesn't matter which one you get. It's a large moth that only flies at night. It's a sphinx moth, we call it. They're large moths. Only way you cannot avoid them, but you could use a botanical, it's a biological control, organic, called BT. It's big B, little t. It's a Bacillus thuringiensis, just think BT, Bacillus bacterium, which is deadly to only caterpillars. If the caterpillar is feeding on foliage which you have dusted or sprayed the plant with, what that bacterial is harmless to every other creature. BT powder, you can put it in a creamer in your coffee. It wouldn't do anything to you. Of course, it wouldn't make coffee taste any better, but it's not going to have any impact on a human. The bacteria interfere with the absorption of nutrients inside the caterpillar's gut, and the caterpillar dies within 24 hours. What you got to do, this is the really scientific method. You look for the big caterpillar poop. It's big because a green hornworm, you know, big poop, big animal. It just goes together. So then you always, because they move so slow and they're the same color as the plant, they're impossible to see. So look for the poop, and where a stem, maybe where the flower is, now they will chew everything off. They will chew the flowers back to the stem. They'll start eating the green fruit if they can, but they do like the foliage and the stems. Look where the poop is, and just hand pick them off and throw them out in the yard. They're not going to find that tomato plant again, but it is, let me tell you, it's difficult. Now, if someone has a lot of tomato plants and insects are a major issue in any type of garden, I'll encourage people to encourage more birds, bluebirds and mockingbirds. And the way you can do that is put a post in the ground about 8 foot high and a crossbar on the top, so it's a perch. And birds will come there and perch on that. Then they can get a good sky view of your garden, and they have really good vision, and they can find the slightest movement of any insect at all. And by doing that, you'll use birds as a insect control in your garden.
Great idea.
Something I didn't talk about, but tomato plants do grow better and are more vigorous and healthy with a red colored material on the base of the plant. And you'll see these sold in garden centers, and this is a proven fact. It's something with the color red. They're sold as little flat trays. Some of them will actually hold a little bit amount of water, and they go around the base of the plant. There are some plastic mulches you can buy that are red. And a friend of mine named Freddie Burcham, who grows the best tomatoes I've ever seen. And he has a very small farm, and he's really not considered a commercial grower. He grows the best tomato plants. He mulches with this red plastic mulch. He's done this forever. This is researched by one land grant university. And he said before he did that, he had okay tomatoes. But when he started putting that red plastic mulch down, his tomatoes grew so much better.
Question dealing with volunteer plants that may come up the following year. A person that was posed this said they've always pulled them up, but I mean, is it let them go or pull them up?
I would suggest letting a few grow. Now they're probably it was from an heirloom plant, they're going to grow true to the parent plant. But if it's a hybrid, yes, hybrid seeds will germinate and grow, but it's gonna resort back to the characteristics of one of the parent plants, which was probably not the most desirable tomato plant. Now, a friend of mine, they let one of these tomatoes grow like that in a garden too. And it grew up, had a nice plant, has smaller tomato plants on it. They still look good. So they picked them off. They said that was the worst tomato they've ever eaten in their life. So it was terrible, they said. I said, well, that's because it was had strong vegetative growth, but the fruit was kind of inferior, didn't have a good flavor. So it was crossbred with another tomato plant that had better flavor, but it had a weak stem maybe. So they came out with a good hybrid. So the hybrid seed that grew produced the characteristic of the poor fruit flavor. And they said it was, so they didn't let him, but do it as an experiment.
Yeah.
And maybe Tom will award you some CEU hours for that.
Sure. I do it all the time. I have great luck with cherry tomatoes on that. I've got them sprouting right now, and I'm trying to decide how many I'm going to keep.
Yeah. You know, some people have told me the best squash they ever came was from a squash that they got too big and they threw in their compost pile, and it seeded and grew out and got the best harvest of squash they ever had. But I don't think it's always true with the tomato plant. Those hybrids will get you.
Somebody else, I assume they may be growing tomatoes from seed, but if it says if the tomato produces flowers prior to transplanting, should you just remove the flowers and transplant, or toss these and go with transplants that haven't flowered yet? And appreciates the presentation.
I would probably, if you're growing some from seed and they bloom too early, this plants, they're trying to fulfill that mission too soon. Not a bad idea to actually remove the flowers. We do this on a lot of fruits sometimes, like blueberries, because it promotes better root growth on plants if you remove some blooms that come on too early. Sometimes environmental conditions will cause plants to set blooms way too early. So I would probably, on a young tomato plant, remove some of the blooms. Don't let it grow vegetatively for a while and grow a good root system and a strong stem area. And then it's still going to have plenty of time to set fruit. Remember, the temperature is what's really critical, and the fruit doesn't set well till the temperatures really warm up.
Any ideas about crop rotation, tomatoes and peppers,
Yeah,
and that kind of stuff?
Generally about, even in a raised bed, if someone has, say, 4 raised beds, and if you grow tomatoes constantly, generally what's going to happen is you're going to probably see eventually, the first couple of years, probably not any diseases, very few insects. But once the plants are planted on a regular seasonal basis, you're going to start seeing more disease probably. And since a lot of the tomato leaves that do get disease fall to the ground and deteriorate, or in your raised bed or in the soil, the spores don't, they overwinter there, just waiting for next season's crop. And you can clean up plant debris, but you can't vacuum up, get all those spores out of the ground. That's impossible. So the potential for a disease, serious problem, will occur years down the road. So if you move anything out of that tomato family, you don't want to put peppers in the same area, potatoes, things like that, the same plant family, move them to another area, particularly in ground. That's really important. Plant a totally different plant family, something in the cucurbits. Cucurbits get certain diseases tomato plants don't get. Something that's a legume, a bean. So you can look up the different plant families, and you can look up on the internet small scale, say, crop rotation or vegetable rotation for disease management, and get a good chart. So you can maybe every couple of years, even if you want to do it every year, but every couple of years, rotate them around. So you don't get a buildup of some potential fungal spores that come back and be a major problem. That's why we want to create a condition for plant growth, not disease.
Yeah. And if you grow tomatoes in the same spot for a while prior to any crop rotation, do you have any thoughts about amendments for the soil? If you're
yeah, there's not anything you're gonna, tomatoes aren't like really heavy feeders. Like if you're growing corn, I mean, corn just strips the nutrients right out of the soil. Now I have friends that friend of mine, Freddie, he grows his best tomatoes, grows them in the same place every year, but he does have some issue with diseases, so he does have to spray at times to curtail the spread of diseases. But it's nothing you can. Well, I always tell people, feed the soil first. The best thing you can do to the soil is add good compost right back in the soil as organic matter, so it can build up soil microbes in the soil. See, it's the soil microbes that actually help convert nutrients into a form that plants can take up. If your soil is not very alive with microbes, you're going to have all the nutrients there, and plants have developed a symbiotic relationship with the certain fungi and bacteria in the soil. And without that life in the soil, you don't have good, healthy plants. You don't have good, healthy food. We're not healthy. So compost, best thing you can do, feed the soil.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Again, there's just a lot of people that just really enjoyed this. And I think I've gone through a lot of the questions. Maybe Lizette, maybe want to correct my Spanish on your sweet tomato and says that they're available at, Crabtree Farms around here is starting, they're selling a lot of different things and having a sale. Anybody else? I think maybe take a couple of minutes if that's okay, if anybody just wants to ask a question.
Remember, you got a
Or if I
really good
missed-
agent in Chattanooga too.
Yeah, I know, but you know,
Sit back.
yeah, we got you trapped.
Well, I get all my information from David, so keep asking these things, and I'll call David up.
Yeah.
We had a fun time in the lab.
We did.
I mean, the samples that would come, we would just get flooded, you know, Tom. Those carts, I thought, well, Friday time come, we try to clean it all up. But I mean,
Right.
it's nothing like it is today. It's pretty mild in the lab, you know.
I was going to tell everybody about the time that a garter snake came in on a sticky board,
Oh man.
and we thought it was just dead. You know, we thought somebody wanted to identify a snake, and David looked at it, or one of us looked at it, and we saw the head moving, and we said, we're going to try to save this snake. So I took some alcohol, and it took me about an hour to get it off of there.
Yeah.
And I said, now what am I going to do? It's probably going to still die. David said, no, let me put it in my aquarium. And he nursed that snake for a good month or two. And then we took it out to Real Foot Lake.
Had a great snake release, we call it. It was filmed. Alan Wyndham filmed it.
That's right. We let it
That's
loose,
right.
and we saved a little garter snake that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I remember putting that little aquarium in a terrarium and give little tiny crickets to it.
Yep.
And I thought, oh, this poor snake. I mean, this would have been a great TV show before people thought to film this type of stuff, you know? Now you get TV
That's what I
shows
say.
on any
David is
ridiculous topic.
one of the best naturalists that I've known in my life. You know, he used to raise hissing cockroaches. You got any of those going now?
No, it was
Kind
that
of
was
gave up on
that
that.
time about my wife, and she realized what I was had upstairs in the house. She said, those are the biggest cockroaches. I said, they're harmless. No cockroaches.
They're great for kids.
Oh man, yeah. But also I was breeding some native scorpions too. And she thought, this is a little shop of horrors up here. She said, this is our house. You can't be doing that. I said, well, okay. So I don't do that stuff anymore, but it's,
Well, it's because of you. I sort of became the bug man of Chattanooga. Everyone thinks I know a little bit about insects, but
we need more bug men, more bug women too.
that's
Not
right.
just something. It's
No,
just me.
the kids go crazy, and we'll have our expo or our garden festival, and we'll teach them a little thing. Yeah, they love it.
Well, we need to respect all life forms on this planet, even the ones we're kind of leery of or scared of or just don't know enough about, because there is a major decline globally of arthropods around the world and invertebrates. And that's a serious issue because insects are valuable food sources for other organisms. And also now there's a major decline in birds populations around the world. And a lot of that's due to habitat loss, you know. We're the species that's responsible for most of this, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
We grow more food on this planet to feed one species, mainly humans. And then we ignore all the other species. But life, as we know it, we would not exist without these other little creatures that help support our life on this planet. So we all, you know, we don't own this planet, we share it. But it's there's a lot of changes going on. So the more we do to educate and get people so they have more respect for it and not scared of them and realize that we're all here together.
I want to thank you so much for coming down. I didn't even know Ron had booked you, and I was pleased to hear that. And I'm sure Ron is delighted he got a good speaker, another good
I
speaker.
enjoyed it too. I've always enjoyed Chattanooga and the people that live there, especially the Master Gardeners. Y'all do a lot. You're well respected by our Master Gardeners, I know, throughout the state. So you're all in good company, and I've been in good company tonight too, and I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we should just have you two sitting together telling stories. I think that would be a.
Yeah, we
Let's get
just
that
started.
on. Let's record that. I'm for that, for sure. Thank you so much. This was great.
You bet.
Thank
Thank
you.
y'all.
Thanks so much, David.